Welcome back to another episode of B.Hooked Crochet. In this tutorial, I'm going to demonstrate how to make the Crochet Comfort Shawl by Yarnspirations. This is a free pattern that you'll download from yarnspirations.com. I've also included the link in the description below. I'm your host, Brittany, and once you gather up your supplies, we're going to work through this pattern from start to finish. Let's get started. We're going to begin our shawls by creating a slip knot. And then we want to chain 4. And initially we're going to start off with a circle. So we're going to join this chain to the first chain that we made. We're going to join with the slip stitch to form a ring. Now we're not actually going to be crocheting in the round, but the way we're setting up this triangle, it kind of looks like we are. So to start row 1, we're going to chain 4. Now this chain 4 counts as a treble crochet. We're going to be working with treble crochets a lot for this pattern. And to do that, just a little reminder, we want to wrap the yarn twice around the hook. And we're going to go into the center of the ring and work 5 treble crochet stitches. Now what we've done here is we've worked on the side of the triangle. So we have one side of it. We're going to chain 2. This is going to act as the point. And then we'll make 6 treble crochets in the center of the ring. So just like we did before, since that chaining of 4 counted as a stitch, we have 6 on the first side, so we want to have 6 on the other side as well. Moving on to row 2, we're going to start by chaining 4. Once again, this is going to count as a treble crochet stitch. And then we want to make 2 treble crochets in the first stitch. So the first being right where that chain 4 is coming from. So this way we have a total of 3 treble crochets in the first stitch, and we have to do this in order to increase so that way our shawl will continue to grow properly. So now we're going to make 1 treble crochet into each of the next 5 stitches. That's going to get us all the way down to the point. Now when we get to the corner, we want to make 2 treble crochets, and I'm just going into the space here. You don't have to work these into the chain. Make 2 treble crochets in that space, and then chain 2. This is going to be the point once again. And then we're going to make 2 more treble crochets in that same chain space. And we'll continue on by making a treble crochet into each of the next 5 stitches. Now this first one is always a little bit tricky to see because it's right next to that chain. It's really easy to skip that stitch. So you just want to make sure, sometimes if you turn it up towards the top, then you can see the V of that stitch and work your treble crochet there. Now, just like we did at the beginning, we have to increase a little bit at the edge here. So we want to make 3 treble crochets in our last stitch, and our last stitch just happens to be that chain. So we chained 4. What we'll need to do is find the very last chain, that top chain right here. We're going to work 3 treble crochets into that chain. If you can, try to catch 2 loops of the chain, and that way it's going to be a little bit more secure of a foundation for you. For row 3, we're going to start by chaining 4 and turn your work, and we'll increase again. So we want to make 2 treble crochets in that first stitch. So there we have a total of 3 stitches. Next, we're going to chain 1. We're going to skip the next stitch, and we'll treble crochet into the next. And then we want to repeat that a total of 4 times. So that one was the first time. So we'll chain 1, skip 1, treble into the next. That'll be 2. Chain 1, skip 1, treble in the next. That'll be the third. Chain 1, skip 1, treble in the next. That will be the fourth. Then we're going to chain 1, we'll skip the next stitch, and then we're going to work our corner pattern or our point pattern here. In this little point here, we just want to make 2 treble crochets. And then we'll chain 2. And treble crochet 2 more times in that same space. Now we're going to do the same thing for the next side because, right, we're just looking at a mirror image from one side to the next. So that's going to be a big help to you as you're trying to memorize this pattern. Whatever you do on one side, it's going to be exactly the same on the other. So we'll chain 1, skip 1, treble crochet into the next. Okay, so that is number 1. Chain 1, skip 1, treble. That will be number 2. Remember, we're doing 4 of these. Chain 1, skip 1, treble. That's 3. Chain 1, skip 1, treble. That's 4. Now we're going to chain 1, and we want to make 3 treble crochet in the last stitch, which once again is that turning chain. So I'm just going to find the top chain and work 3 treble crochets. Now we're moving on to row 4. We're going to start by chaining 4. We'll turn our work, and we're increasing again, so we want to make 2 treble crochets in the very first stitch here. Now what we're going to do is make a treble crochet in every one of our chain 1 spaces and in every one of our stitches. So we're just transitioning back to this solid pattern. So we're going to have rows that are solid and we're going to have rows that have spaces in between the stitches. So we have 2 stitches starting out here, so we'll treble crochet into each of those. And now we have a chain 1 space. Now you don't have to work your hook into the chain, you can just insert it into the space and work your stitch. And treble crochet into the next stitch. And into the chain 1 space. You're just going to do this until we get to the point. Now when you get to the point, we have 2 stitches here that are side by side. We still want to maintain our pattern by making a treble crochet into each one of those stitches. And we're going to treat the point the same way. So we'll make 2 treble crochets. We'll chain 2. That'll create the point for the next round. And we'll treble crochet 2 more in the same space. Now we'll just look at our work. We have 2 treble crochets here that are coming up next. So we'll make a treble crochet into each one of those stitches. And then we have a chain 1 space. We'll treble crochet there. Treble crochet in the next stitch. And again, this is just review. We're doing the same thing on this side as we just did on the previous side. When you get to the very last stitch, we want to increase once again, so we will make 3 treble crochets into that turning chain. One of the things I recommend too, if you're having a hard time finding the right chain to work your stitches into, what I will do is mark that chain with a stitch marker. So for example, to start row 5, we're going to chain up 4 once again. And then I will just take a locking stitch marker and put it in that chain. Now I can just leave that there. When I come back around, that will be marking the spot where I need to work my stitches. So that's just a little suggestion if you're having difficulty seeing where to work your last 3 stitches. So row 5, we've already chained up 4. I'm going to turn my work, and this is going to be another simple round where we just make 1 treble crochet into every stitch until we get to the point. Now with the exception of the first stitch, we do want to make 2 treble crochets in that first stitch. Now we're going to make 1 treble crochet into every stitch until we get to that chain 2 space down at the bottom. When you've made it to the chain 2 point, we're going to treat this the same way as before. We'll make 2 treble crochets, chain 2, and then 2 more treble crochets all in this chain 2 space. Now what we'll do is make 1 treble crochet into every stitch until we get to the very last one. And when you've made it to the end of row 5, you'll make 3 treble crochets in your turning chain. And we just have one more row to cover before we reach a pretty big repeated section in our shawls. And honestly, it's just a repeat back here of row 4. We're going to chain 4. We'll turn our work. Make 2 treble crochets in the first stitch. Then we're going to chain 1, skip 1, treble crochet in the next, and that's our little repeated section for the side. We'll chain 1, skip 1, treble crochet in the next. We're going to repeat that until we get to the chain 2 space. So when you get to the chain 2 space, you're still going to repeat that. So we have our treble crochet, I chained 1, then I have 1 stitch here, which I'm not going to do anything with. I'm going to just go ahead and work the corner pattern here. So 2 treble crochets, chain 2, and 2 treble crochets in that corner chain 2 space. Now we're going to chain 1, skip a stitch, treble crochet in the next. Okay, so this is our same repeat as the other side. Chain 1, skip 1, treble crochet into the next. And we'll repeat that until we get to the last stitch. And when we get to the end here, so I have my treble crochet, I'm still going to chain 1, I'm still going to skip 1, and now I have, here's where I place that marker. So I can remove the marker so it tells me where I need to work my last 3 treble crochet stitches. What we're going to do moving forward is we're going to repeat rows 4, 5, and 6 2 more times. So we're going to do 4, 5, 6, 4, 5, 6. And then what we want to do is repeat rows 4 and row 5 after that. So we're going to do 4, 5, 6, 4, 5, 6, 4, 5. Okay, so that's what I need for you to do at this point. You can find all this information on the written instructions. Again, you can get that link in the video description below. When we come back to the video, I will have those sections crocheted, and then we're going to change colors, and then we'll get to the really fun border. So at this point you should have a total of 14 rows from start to finish. So we did that little repeat section there, and we're going to change colors to color B. Now what I'm going to do is show you just a little bit of a tip here. So many of you probably have your row finished like this. So you have your last stitch completely finished, and you would be ready then to chain and start working on your next row. What I like to do when I change colors, and I'm just going to pull this first loop out. Actually, I'll finish the stitch. I'll work the stitch just so you can see how I do this. You'll want to work your stitch so that you have 2 loops left on your hook. And when you do that, you can go ahead and grab color B, make your slip knot, and then place that slip knot loop on your hook, tighten it up, and pull it through the 2 remaining loops. Now that's how I like to do color transitions. There are different ways of doing so. One final step, of course, we're going to break the yarn from color A. And since this loop is a little bit loose now at this point, what I like to do is just take the 2 ends and tie them together. That way that last stitch doesn't get too loose on me. So you can tie this in a double knot, and then you'll just weave those tails in once you've finished. So we have another little repeated section that we're going to cover using color B. We're going to work rows 6, and then we're going to work row 4. So go ahead and work row 6 and then row 4, which ends up being row 6 is where we have the chain in between, and row 4 is a solid row. So we're going to have a sort of a lace row and a solid row. Then once we do that, we have a pretty intricate border that we're going to work with this pattern, and I want to make sure that we dedicate a lot of time to that section so that you don't get lost. Once you've made it through your 15th and your 16th row, now we're finished with color B. What we want to do is fasten off. And you can do this a couple of ways. So I showed you one way before where we pulled it through those last 2 loops on our hook. The other way you can do it is just simply finish this stitch off. So I'm just pulling the tail through the loop on my hook. And when you turn your work and we're ready to fasten on color C, the new color, I'm just going to start with my hook in the first stitch. Now before we join on the new color, I want to encourage you to count your stitches just to make sure everything has worked out the way it should. At the end of row 16, you need to have a total of 132 treble crochet stitches. So go ahead and count them. You're not going to count the 2 chains up here at the end. That's not going to be in your count, but you'll just count the treble crochets. You need 132 to start on the next section, which is the border for the shawl. Okay, so here I am with color C. I'm going to create a slip knot. I already have my hook in the first stitch, so I'll just place that slip knot on my hook, pull it through the stitch, and then we'll chain 3. Before we just start off with that easy stitch pattern, we do need to increase, and we're going to do so by making 2 double crochets in the first stitch. So that is going into the same stitch that my chain 3 is coming from, the same stitch that I fastened onto. So we'll have a total of 3 stitches in the first stitch, or that treble crochet here. Now we're simply going to make 1 double crochet into every stitch until we get to the point down at the bottom. So our chain 2 space down there. So one thing to watch out for, especially after you've come off a pattern where you've worked a lot of treble crochet stitches, it'll become second nature for you to wrap the yarn around your hook twice, right? To work the treble crochet. Just remember that for the double crochet, we're only wrapping the yarn once. Now when we get to the point, you're going to work that same stitch pattern that you're already comfortable with, only this time we're working with double crochets instead of trebles. So we're going to make 2 double crochets in the chain 2 space. We'll chain 2. And then work 2 more double crochets in the same gap space. Now from here, we're going to work 1 double crochet into every stitch until we get to the very last one. When you've made it to your last stitch, of course, again, that's going to be a turning chain. We're going to make 3 double crochets into that top turning chain. If you make your chains pretty tight like I did here, obviously you'll have a little bit of trouble getting your hook in there. Okay, so that wraps up our last, we'll say, really easy row for the border of this pattern. But I want to say that loosely because the border here itself is not very difficult, but if you look at the written instructions, you would probably think otherwise. It looks super complicated, but I promise it's not. You will see a pattern. And I want to talk about the diagram too, because, anybody can follow the written instructions and, it kind of gets a little confusing, a little bit wordy. So what I would really recommend is following along with the diagram portion. Now, of course, we'll cover the rows here on the tutorial, but this is a really great opportunity for you to learn and be comfortable with crochet diagrams. So I'm going to take a couple of minutes just to pull the diagram up on the screen and demonstrate how you're going to read that diagram and how it relates to this pattern. On page 3 of the pattern is where you're going to find the diagram, and we're going to focus our attention on this section right here, and of course we'll take note of the stitch key so we know what each one of these symbols means. Now this section of the diagram covers rounds 16 through 14. So we've already covered 16, we've already covered 17. We're going to move on to row 18 next. A couple of things I want to point out here is that there is a pattern to this. So we should be able to look at our work and just know where the stitches are going and how they're coming together after we start with, we'll call this our foundation row. This is going to be the foundation of our pattern. And our pattern that specifically uses these clustered stitches and brings everything together. So we can see that our double crochet stitches are going to form kind of a triangle in this direction, and that is going to mirror the clusters that are right here. Diagrams are always so much easier to work off of because you can actually see what you need to do, and there's no need to read whatsoever. So we're going to start on row 18. We're going to work our first stitch, which ends up being a chain 5. Now you see it here as a stitch, but at the beginning of row 18 we're going to chain 5. That's going to count as a double crochet in this chain 2, and then we're just going to count. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We're going to make 7 double crochet in a row. We're going to chain 2 and we're going to skip 2, work the cluster in the next, chain 2, skip 2, and then work our 7 double crochet in a row. We're going to do that until we get to the corner, and then of course things get a little bit different. So again, we're going to cover this in the video tutorial. I wouldn't be super concerned with whether or not you fully understand this, but like I said, this is a really great opportunity to learn how to read diagrams if you don't already know, and if you do know how to read diagrams, most likely you won't need to follow along with the next section of our tutorial. You'll have everything right here in front of you. Well, let's dive back into the studio and work on our 18th row, and we'll tackle the rest of this border. Okay, so the next thing that we are going to do is move on to row 18. And again, if you're following the written instructions, it's going to look a lot more cumbersome than it actually is. There is a pretty simple repeat to each one of these rows, even though there's a pretty big paragraph of instructions. So the first thing that we'll do to begin the row, now I've already turned my work, is we will chain 5. And that chain 5 is going to count as a double crochet, so 3 chains count as a double crochet, and then 2 are 2 turning chains. Now the next thing we're going to be doing is make 1 double crochet into each of the 7 stitches, and we don't have to increase here like we normally have been, where we've made 3 stitches into the first, because 2 of those chains, that's sort of acting as our increase here. So we're not going to double crochet where this turning chain is coming from. We're going to skip over to the next stitch. And you can usually determine that by the wording in the pattern. So it says to double crochet into each of the next 7 stitches, or sometimes you'll just see it say double crochet in the next. If it wants you to work into the same stitch, it'll usually say to work in the same stitch. So I'm just going to work my 7 double crochets. Now once you've made your 7 double crochet, we're going to chain 2 and skip 2 stitches, so 1 and 2, and we're going to make a cluster into the next. So we're going to work our cluster by yarning over, insert your hook into the designated stitch, so that third one over, yarn over and pull up a loop. So now we have 3 loops on our hook. We'll yarn over, pull through 2, and we'll just leave those 2 there. Now yarn over, insert your hook into the same stitch, yarn over and pull up a loop. Now we have 4 loops on our hook. We'll yarn over, pull through 2 of those, and we have 3. We're going to do that one more. Yarn over, insert your hook in the same stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, and pull through 2. And now we need to finish things off. So we'll have 4 loops on our hook. We'll yarn over, pull through all 4 of those loops. And that's how we work the clustered stitch. So from here, we're going to chain 2, skip 2 stitches. So we've made our 2 chains. We'll skip 2, and we're going to double crochet into each of the next 7. Now this is part of our pattern repeat. So if you are following along with the written instructions, our repeat, actually the star is before we get to this 7 double crochet. So we're going to repeat the section where we have 7 double crochets, chain 2, cluster, chain 2. So that little section right here is our pattern repeat for this side of the shawl. So the instructions say that we're going to complete that a total of 4 more times. And basically, to eyeball it, you're just going to work that until you get to the point down at the bottom. Okay, so I have my 7 here. I'm going to chain 2, skip 2, cluster in the next, chain 2, skip 2, and repeat. So go ahead and repeat that until you're on your last one. So we'll have a total of 5. We already have our first one, our second one. We're working on our 3rd little repeat. And come back when you're on the 5th repeat. Okay, so I have worked up to my 5th repeat. So this is the 5th cluster. in my first side of row 18. Now what we want to do is we're going to start working on this point here. We're going to do something a little bit special and different there, but we're not really changing up the stitches too much. We're going to skip 2 and make 1 double crochet into each of the next 7. So this is pretty much just a repeat. It's just worded differently in the written instructions. So that's why we're covering it here. Now we're going to chain 2 and we're going to skip 2, but it's just easier to look at the chain 2 space. So this is the point down at the bottom. We're going to make a cluster in this chain 2 space. And then we'll chain 1. Make another cluster in the same space. And chain 1. And then we'll make one final cluster in this chain 2 space. And we'll chain 2 after that last cluster, and then we're going to work everything in reverse. We're going to skip 2, work 1 double crochet in the next 7, and we're starting our repeat here. So our repeat is 7 double crochet, chain 2, skip 2, cluster, chain 2, skip 2, and then back to your 7 double crochet. So go ahead and finish that until you get to the last little bit of this row. We'll meet back up and we'll talk about how to finish off this row. Okay, so at a glance at the end of row 18, you're going to have 5 clustered stitches. Now, of course, you want to make sure that you're counting everything out properly because this row is sort of setting the foundation for the next 6 rows. And if your count is off here, then the rest of the pattern is going to be thrown off. So I like to simplify things. You know, the clustered stitch stands out to me, so I'm just counting that there are 5 along each side. And of course, you have the 3 clusters in the point. Now, after you've worked your last 7 double crochet, you'll end up with 1 stitch remaining, and it's really easy to forget this stitch because it's the chain 3. What we want to do is chain 2, and then we'll double crochet in that top turning chain. Now here you're looking at the back of the chain, and I'm just going to double crochet in that top chain. So that chain 2 is helping us to continue the increase, and it also mirrors the other side. Well, let's get started on row 19. To begin row 19, I've already turned my work. We're going to chain 3, which is going to count as a double crochet, and we're going to cluster in the first stitch, so the same place where our chain 3 is coming from. And we'll chain 1 and cluster again in the same stitch. And now we will chain 2 and make a cluster in the same stitch. So we'll make our second cluster here. And now we're going to skip the next chain and the first stitch, and we're going to locate the space in between that first and second double crochet. For row 19, we're going to make our double crochets in between the posts. So instead of working in the V like we're used to, we are going to go just in between the space. And we'll do that for a total of 6 double crochets. So there's one. We'll locate the next space. That's 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now we're going to chain 2, and we're just going to find our cluster. We're going to work our next stitch right here in the cluster. We're going to make 1 cluster, so work a cluster stitch, chain 2, and then work another cluster in the same stitch. We'll chain 2, and then we're going to start our repeat. So let's just look at this. Instead of having to count stitches, it's so much easier to learn how to read the stitches to follow your repeat. So you'll notice that on this section, of course, we worked our double crochets in the space between, but there's one less stitch. And we started in between the first and the second. Now that's going to be the case. We're going to find the first and the second. We'll double crochet in between those, and then continue until we have 6 double crochets. And we'll chain 2. We'll find our next cluster, and we'll work our cluster, chain 2, cluster, then chain 2, and we'll repeat. So this is all just a repeat. We're going to, of course, continue along with this stitch pattern until we get to the point we'll do something a little bit different. Okay, so I've worked that repeat all the way to the point down at the very bottom. I've worked 6 double crochet in between the stitches of that group of 7, the very last one, before we get to the 3 clusters on the point. So the way we want to do the point is we'll chain 2, we'll find our first cluster stitch, and we're going to work the same stitch pattern for this one, which is cluster, chain 2, cluster. We're going to work all of that in this first clustered stitch. So cluster, chain 2, cluster. And we'll chain 2 and repeat that for the other 2 cluster stitches. Okay, once we finish that, we'll chain 2, and then we're starting now on the last side, and we're going to treat this exactly the same. So I'm going to make 1 double crochet in between each of the next 6 stitches. And for each one of our clusters, we're going to do cluster, chain 2, cluster. So go ahead and finish that up, and we'll meet back up at the very end of this row. Now we're diving right into row number 20. It's really similar to the previous row with just a few differences. We're going to begin the row by chaining 6, and this chain 6 is counting as a double crochet, so 3 of those chains are double crochet, and then 3 chains is a chain 3 that we're going to be working with. Now from here we're going to find the chain 2 space in between these two clusters. So they look a little bit different on the back. Find your cluster and we're going to work this stitch pattern. We're going to cluster, chain 2, and cluster, all in this chain 2 space. Now we're going to chain 3, so that's one of the differences here. We've probably gotten into the habit of chaining 2 after our clusters. We want to make sure we're chaining 3 for this row. Now we're just going to jump ahead to our section of now 6 double crochet. We want to locate the first and the second, and we're going to double crochet in between that space. So this part is the same. We're working our stitches in between the posts rather than in the stitch. The difference here is that we're working 5 now instead of 6. Okay, so then it looks something like that. We'll chain 3. And now we have our 2 clusters here. We'll find that chain 2, so you can just sort of pull it apart to see that. And we'll work a cluster, a chain 2, and a cluster, all in that space. And that is our repeat. So what I need for you to do is work this along the remainder of this first side, and we'll come back at the point, and we'll talk about what we're going to do there on this row. So I've worked that pattern all the way to the point here at the bottom, and I have made my chain 3. And what I want to do is focus on the groups of 2. So I'm just going to focus on this first group of 2 clusters. I'm going to find the chain 2 in between them and work my similar pattern for the cluster. So cluster, chain 2, cluster. Now in between these groups, I'm going to chain 3 just like I had been before. So we'll chain 3 and we'll find the next group of 2. So I'm just going to locate that chain 2 space in between them and work a cluster, chain 2, cluster. Now chain 3, find my last group of 2, work cluster, chain 2, cluster, in the chain 2 space between them. Now we'll chain 3, and we'll just start on our regular repeat for the last row. So I have chained 3, I'm going to find that group of 6, work 1 double crochet in between each of them for a total of 5 double crochets. Okay, so just repeat that similar stitch pattern that we worked at the very beginning, and we'll meet back up at the end of row 20. Now at the end of row 20, so I have my 5 double crochet here, I'm going to chain 3, and I'm going to locate the chain 2 space in between these 2 clusters and work a cluster, chain 2, cluster. And to finish things off, we will chain 3 and we'll make a double crochet into the last double crochet, which again is a chain 3. So we'll just find our 3rd chain and we'll double crochet there to finish off row 20. Now we're moving right along to row 21. It's always a good idea to take a couple of seconds just, before you start a new row, just to make sure everything looks right. Okay, so if there are any major issues going on, you might have some tension issues where it's either bowing out or it's kind of buckling in. Just take a few seconds to look and make sure everything seems to look all right, and we'll move on to row 21. Now row 21 is very similar to row 20 with, a couple of changes. We're going to begin by making 7 chains. So 3 of those chains count as a double crochet, 4 chains count as 4 chains, because we're going to make 4 chains in between our clustered groups. So we're going to locate this first chain 2, and we'll work our same pattern, cluster, chain 2, cluster. Now we're going to chain 4. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. We're going to skip this section here. We'll find our group of 5. So just like we have been doing, we're going to work in between the posts. This time that's going to mean a total of 4 double crochets. So that's 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then we'll start our repeat. We'll chain 4, find the chain 2 space in between the clusters, work cluster, chain 2, cluster. And you'll work that until you get to the point down at the bottom. And I'm going to go ahead and work up to that point, and then I will show you how we're going to treat row 21 down at the point. Now when you've reached the bottom point, we're going to treat this very similarly as we did for row 20. We're going to chain 4 before we get there. So we'll make 4 chains after that 4th double crochet. We'll find the next group of 2. We'll work cluster, chain 2, cluster. And we'll chain 4 in between, so in between these groups of 2. So we'll find that next group, work cluster, chain 2, cluster, chain 4, and then we'll find that last group of 2 in the corner here, work cluster, chain 2, cluster. Okay, now we will chain 4, and we'll just dive back into our repeat. So I'll find my next group of 5. I'll work a double crochet in between each of those for a total of 4. And then you'll just maintain the rest of your pattern repeat. Now moving on to row 22, I've already turned my work here. We're going to chain 3, and that's going to count as a double crochet. And we're also going to double crochet into the same stitch that our chain 3 is coming from. So that's that last double crochet we made on the previous row. Now we're going to chain 3. We're going to skip this chain 4 space, and we're going to work into this space in between these 2 clusters. So we've been doing groups of 2. Now for this row, we're going to increase that a little bit. We're going to do cluster, chain 2, cluster, chain 2. Now if you need to scoot things over, you might find that'll help you to work the last cluster into that same space. So this time we'll have a total of 3 clusters in our groups. And when you've finished up that 3rd cluster, we're going to chain 3. And we're going to find that group of 4 double crochet stitches. We're going to treat this the same way. We're going to find the 1st and the 2nd, double crochet in between them, and continue that for a total now of 3 double crochets. Now we're going to chain 3. Now you'll find the next group of 2 clusters. You'll find that chain 2 space, and we'll work the same pattern here. So we'll have 3 clusters instead of just 2. So that's cluster, chain 2, cluster, chain 2, and cluster. And that is our repeat for this side. Go ahead and finish that up until you get to the point, and we'll talk about how to do that. Now when you've made it down to the point at the bottom, we're going to just work the same repeat that we have been in between the groups of 2 clusters. So what we have is 3 groups of 2 in our point, and for each one of those groups we're going to do cluster, chain 2, cluster, chain 2, cluster. Okay, so I'll work that here. Now in between each one of those we're going to continue with 3 chains, and then we'll repeat. So find your next 2 and work that stitch pattern. So you're going to repeat that for this group of 2 and for the last group of 2 for the corner. Then once you've completed the point, you'll continue with your repeat down the second side of the shawl. Now at the end of row 22, we're going to find our 3rd chain. So we're going to count up 1, 2, and 3. We will chain 3 after our group of clusters there, and we want to make 2 double crochets in that 3rd chain, and that's going to finish off the row. Now we're moving on to our second to last row, which is row 23. We're going to start the same way. So we'll chain 3, we'll find our first stitch, or the same stitch where the chain is coming from, and we'll double crochet there. Then we're going to chain 3 and move over to our group of 3 clusters. Now in each one of these chain 2 spaces we're going to cluster, chain 2, and cluster. Now after this little section here, we're going to chain 3. We'll find our 3 double crochets, and we're going to work 1 double crochet in between each of those. So we'll just have a total of 2 now for this row. We'll chain 3, and then we'll begin our repeat. So we'll work this little section the same that we just did right here, and we're just going to repeat that until we get to the point. When you've made your way down to the point, we're going to treat these 3 groups exactly the same that we have for the previous 3 down the sides. And what we're going to do in between each of the 3 is chain 3. So this is what our point looks like now, and we're just going to finish our pattern repeat for the last side of the shawl, and then we just have 1 more row to go. And once you've made it to the end of row 23, I have my chain 3. I'm going to locate my chain 3, my turning chain here, and I'm going to make 2 double crochets in that top turning chain, or that 3rd turning chain. Now we're moving on to the final row of our prayer shawls, and we're just going to jump right into row 24. We're going to chain 3, which counts as a double crochet. We're going to skip the next double crochet in this chain space. We want to find the chain 2 space in between these first 2 clusters, and we're going to cluster, chain 2, and cluster in that space. Then we're going to chain 2, and we'll locate the next chain 2 space, so in between the next 2 clusters, and here we're going to do 3 clusters. So just like we did in the previous row, we'll cluster, chain 2, cluster, chain 2, cluster. Lots of clustering here. Then we're going to chain 2. We'll locate the chain 2 space in between that next group, and we'll work that first repeat. So cluster, chain 2, cluster. Okay, so that's what it looks like after that first repeated section. So we're going to repeat that group for every one of these little sections where we're kind of fanning out. Then we're going to locate the 2 double crochet that are right here, and we'll double crochet in between them. So no chaining or anything like that. We'll just double crochet right into it, and then we'll go into our repeat. So just like we did back here in this section. So go ahead and repeat this stitch pattern until you get to the point down at the bottom. So when you get to the point down at the bottom, I just wanted to point out that we're really not doing anything different here. So this little section right here is the point, and you can see we have 3 fans that look exactly like they do here. So this same stitch pattern repeat that we've been doing for every single one of these fans, we're going to do for each of the 3 little fans for the point. So I've worked through the first repeat of the first fan of the point, and I want to just bring it to your attention that in between these groups we're going to chain 2. So in between that repeat we're going to chain 2, then I'll work the same stitch pattern here as I did here, which is also the same as this section right here. So you'll do that, you'll chain 2, you'll work that repeat again, and then you're going to continue on with the repeat for the side. So you'll double crochet in between these 2, you'll work your fan repeat here, double crochet, fan repeat, and you'll just finish that up until you get to the end of the row. And once you make it to the end of row 24, we'll just find our first double crochet, which is actually that turning chain. So we'll find the 3rd chain and we'll double crochet there, and that will finish things off. So we can go ahead and fasten off. Now all we need to do is weave in our ends, and what I would recommend, of course, is to make sure that you're weaving in the colors under the stitches that correspond with the stitch, but also to work under a group of stitches. That concludes our tutorial on the Crochet Comfort Shawl from Yarnspirations.com. I'm your host, Brittany. You can find more tutorials from me at B.Hooked Crochet on my YouTube channel as well as my website.